I spent half of my life believing that power came from the deafening roar of fighter jets cutting through the sky and blind obedience to orders. But one day, inside the silence of the cockpit, a recitation in Arabic pierced through my headset and tore down every wall I had built. In that instant I realized no weapon I had ever flown was stronger than those words. My name is David Miller. I am 50 years old, and I live in the United States. I was molded from a young age to live under strict rules, carrying on my shoulders the discipline and the weight of decisions that affected lives thousands of miles away. The uniform and the commands had always seemed enough to give meaning to my existence, until the moment I realized there was an emptiness no rank could fill. What happened to me was not the result of technology, strategy, or military power. It was something as simple as it was unexpected, a recitation that pierced through the silence of the cockpit and made me see that I needed answers beyond military borders. Before I continue with my story of conversion, write in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. The mission unfolded like so many others: precise takeoff, steady controls, protocols followed down to the last detail. The cockpit, illuminated by digital panels, wrapped me in a false sense of absolute control. Everything indicated normalcy. Yet, that silent night, the space between me and the skies, began to stretch in a way no flight manual could explain. The light that appeared beside the aircraft did not behave like a reflection, nor like a common atmospheric phenomenon. It was steady, pulsing in rhythm, as if observing my every move. The co-pilot noticed nothing. The sensors detected no anomaly, but there, just inches from the glass, I felt something that transcended both concrete and metal. The cockpit, once reduced to commands and routines, now seemed larger than the very airbase I had departed from, as if it were an invisible arena where another kind of battle was beginning. At the same time, a sound that did not come from the communication headset made its way into me. They were not words I understood, but each syllable carried weight and clarity, like water sliding over dry stone. It was the same melody that had surfaced on another flight, and, even so, its force always felt new. The recitation sounded without depending on speakers, cables, or frequencies. The space was in technical silence, but my soul heard a call I could not deny. And then, in the middle of that controlled calm, the memories of the reports I had signed began to surround me. Cold lines of paper spoke of clean surgical operations, but in truth they hid entire cities reduced to ruins. Children running among rubble, broken families, all masked by expressions like collateral damage. Inside the cockpit, surrounded by advanced technology and military protocols, it was impossible to ignore that the echoes of my decisions had created wounds that never healed. 3 questions became engraved in me from that night. Why did that light seem to move with intention alongside me? What was the origin of the voice only I could hear? And above all, how would I deal with the silent weight of conscience for acts I had justified as duty? The cockpit became larger than any base or medal. It was now the place where my most intimate war began. The academies had trained me to solve problems in seconds: hydraulic failure, loss of altitude, sudden attack. Every muscle conditioned to react before the mind finished the reasoning. I was the product of years of military conditioning, a cog serving speed and obedience. But no manual, no simulator, had ever prepared me for what happened that night. Peace invading my headset as if it were a command, yet with a tone unlike anything I had known. There was no technical interference recorded. The panels remained stable, the radios showed absolute silence, and the tower reported no nearby traffic. The crew stayed calm, focused only on the routine checklist. I, however, felt a paradoxical lightweight resting over me. That voice did not shout, did not threaten, did not impose itself with the violence typical of military orders. It was serene, firm, and at the same time soft, as if it spoke directly to the deepest hidden space within my soul. What unsettled me most was the absence of operational logic. There was no frequency source, no electronic record. Everything that made up my reality as a pilot, cables, circuits, redundancies, was intact. And yet the sound was there, real, audible, undeniable. My military instinct wanted to catalogue, justify, archive it as auditory anomaly under fatigue. But something greater within me resisted that excuse. It wasn't a failure, it was direction. While I kept my hands steady on the controls, a strange memory surfaced. In survival training, we learned that in extreme situations, the body searches for oxygen where there is none. It is instinct. But at that moment, I realized my spirit was doing the same, searching for meaning in noises I had always ignored. The difference was that instead of despair, there was an inexplicable peace, a luminous silence, as if the cockpit had been transformed into a sanctuary. Suddenly I realized that something greater was at stake than simply keeping the aircraft on course. It was as if that sound was shifting the center of gravity of my life. For years, my axis had been the military hierarchy, the flag, the oath to protect a nation. Now, before a verse I didn't even fully understand, all of that structure seemed fragile, almost childlike. In that instant, I understood that perhaps I was not facing a technical anomaly, but a silent invitation. The strength I had cultivated all my life revealed itself as insufficient before something that demanded no weapons, only listening. In impeccable uniform, I walked through corridors where every word carried strategic weight. The walls displayed medals, flags, and symbols of greatness. Inside, everything seemed solid, unshakable, but within me, discreet cracks began to open. In the morning briefings, people spoke of stability and peacekeeping missions. In the reports I read at night, I found records of neighborhoods reduced to ashes, entire populations turned into statistics. The contradiction was like an echo that would not stop. I began to record these tensions on checklist cards, as if they were flight notes. In the space reserved for emergencies, where I would normally write electrical failure or check hydraulic pressure, I started to put phrases that did not fit the routine of a pilot. What if the enemy is my narrative? I wrote in firm letters. On the next card I scribbled, what if the target is my pride? Days later, another line. What if victory is silence? It was my way of dealing with something I could not speak aloud, as if I were preparing a parallel manual, not for aircraft, but for the soul. On the outside, nothing had changed. I still carried out every order with discipline, adjusting routes and coordinating crews. To anyone looking in, I was the same confident commander with an impeccable record. But I no longer served the same king. The authority that had always been at the center of my life now felt distant, almost weakened. There was an empty space growing inside me, one I used to smother with patriotism, reports, and routine. This emptiness didn't destroy me. On the contrary, it forced me to face questions I had always buried. When I remembered the serene voice that had pierced through my headset, I felt I could no longer live only on the surface. Each time I reviewed the statistics of operations they called surgical, the echo of that piece returned. It was as if someone were telling me there was a hierarchy higher than any rank. I began to watch my own gestures with strangeness. The rigid salute before superiors felt mechanical, almost automatic. The confidence I displayed in briefings sounded too rehearsed. The flawless pilot was intact in front of everyone, but inside I was like a fuselage under extreme stress, shining on the outside, fractured within. In those cracks, something new was breathing. I realized I could no longer ignore the contrast between the man who executed orders and the human being who was beginning to feel. The space between those two roles was becoming unbearable, and I knew that sooner or later I would have to choose which one I would allow to live. The night was heavy, the kind where the body begs for rest but the mind refuses to sleep. I opened the translation of the Quran I had kept with me for weeks, not even knowing why. My eyes passed over several pages until a short verse stopped me like brakes on a wet runway. Say He is Allah the One. Just a few words direct without adornment. I read it in Portuguese and already felt the impact. When I sought the recitation in Arabic, the same phrase gained a new texture. It sounded like water falling over burning stone. There were no external effects, nothing resembling the moments of alert I was used to in missions. It wasn't the roar of turbines or the jolt of combat maneuvers. It was something silent, yet profound, as if an invisible lock had been released within me. I, who had always carried belts, vests, protocols, and layers of protection, felt as if someone had cut through them all at once. For the first time in a very long while, I breathed fully, without weight. The simplicity of the phrase dismantled decades of military instruction. I had spent years studying complex strategies, intelligence reports, and meticulous flight plans. None of them had ever given me clarity like those few words. They didn't come loaded with justifications or arguments. They simply affirmed something absolute, non-negotiable. I realized all my training had taught me to react, to be prepared for any contingency. But this wasn't about reaction, it was about surrender. I kept repeating the verse softly, almost like a breathing exercise. Each time I spoke it, I felt a piece of the hardness inside me dissolve. It was as if the steel of my inner uniform had begun to rust before something stronger than itself. I discovered that the strength I had searched for so long was not in weapons, ranks, or medals. It was in recognizing the one, without intermediaries, without masks. I closed the book and remained in silence, still sitting on the edge of the bed. The night went on, but inside me time seemed different. I didn't think about sharing it with anyone, nor did I make immediate plans. I just stayed there, feeling the lightness of a burden I hadn't even known I carried until then. For the first time, I didn't need reports, radars, or external confirmations to believe what was before me. That verse was enough. In that moment, I understood I had discovered a foundation stronger than any runway, and without realizing it, I had begun to prepare for a takeoff that obeyed no known manual. Military training had always taught me that every conflict had precise coordinates, longitude, latitude, defined targets. But the war I had begun to face wasn't recorded on any map. There was no briefing, satellite, or strategy that could guide me. It was an internal battle, fought in silence, where the enemy was invisible and yet far too intimate. Each time I read a passage from the Quran, the words seemed to pull me away from the external battlefield and place me before trenches I myself had dug inside. The short, direct phrases brought something no general's order had ever achieved. They disarmed my instinct for violence. I realized courage wasn't about accelerating through risky maneuvers or keeping a steady finger on invisible triggers thousands of meters above the ground. Courage, I discovered, was admitting I didn't know how to live without rage. That realization struck me harder than any impact in flight. Rage had been my fuel for decades, and without it, I didn't know who I was. The speeches that once inflamed me began to sound hollow. Words like defense, freedom, and honor lost their weight when contrasted with the calm of a single verse affirming divine unity. The echo of my old convictions grew weaker, like radio voices laced with interference, while the recitation remained clear within me, even when I wasn't hearing anything aloud. It was a voice that needed no frequency to be heard. I started to notice how my whole life had been conditioned to obey without question. Suddenly, questioning became inevitable. I no longer asked about external strategies, but about what truly supported my own choices. I began reviewing my combat memories, not as victories, but as chapters of cultivated blindness. How many times had I confused destruction with success? How many times had I called glory what was only disguised pain? These reflections were like projectiles ricocheting inside me without rest. The struggle intensified when I realized there was no way back to the ignorance I once lived in. Once the heart is exposed to something true, it can no longer pretend it hasn't seen. I continued to play my role before others, maintaining discipline, firmness, and silence. But inside, I was no longer piloting only aircraft. I was piloting an inner duel, a borderless battle where every doubt was a potential enemy, and every certainty a fragile trench. That inner conflict demanded an energy I had never spent before. Sleeping became difficult, not because of noise, but because the silence was too heavy. Each night, between reports and voices of the past, I went back to repeating the verses that disarmed me, and with each repetition, another piece of the armor I had built over the years fell away. It wasn't defeat, it was revelation. The mission had changed its target, and now it was me. At that point, I understood that the maps I had followed all my life were outdated. I could know every air route in the world, but I still didn't know the way back to myself, and if there were no external coordinates for that journey, I had no choice but to learn how to navigate by the only compass that never failed, the truth already pulsing inside my chest. When military discipline was the center of my life, I believed my service record was what defined my worth. The decorations lined up on my uniform, the formal greetings received in the corridors, the flawless reports I signed, all of that seemed enough to justify who I was. But as I immersed myself in the words that began to transform me, I realized the true accounting of existence is not measured by medals. It is measured by the impact we leave on others, for better or for worse. It was then that an unexpected need took hold of me, to make amends, not just to reflect, but to act. With every face that came to mind, I remembered a harsh phrase spoken with arrogance, a gesture of disdain and indifference that had wounded unnecessarily. The weight was not only in the orders I carried out in the field, or the operations I supported, it was also in the way I, shielded by authority, had treated those who had no means to defend themselves. I realized that violence is not manifested only in bombs dropped or battles fought, but also in sharp words, looks of superiority, and the refusal to listen. I began seeking out those people, Some were still close by, squadron colleagues, hangar technicians, subordinates who for years had swallowed my harshness as if it were a natural part of hierarchy. To them I asked forgiveness, not with rehearsed speeches, but with simple gestures, an honest conversation, public acknowledgement, even respectful silence where once there had been imposition. Others were no longer within my reach, and for them I tried to make amends in other ways, with prayers, donations, actions that reflected the change taking place inside me. This process taught me something I had never heard in any command room. Guilt can be a prison, but it can also be a bridge to freedom. When I tried to suppress it, it corroded my peace. But when I transformed guilt into reparation, I discovered it could be redemptive. With every apology, with every invisible debt repaid, I felt as if I were rebuilding part of what had been destroyed within myself. It was along this path that I understood God is not impressed by resumes or positions. To him, logged flight hours, earned titles, or oaths repeated in ceremonies mean nothing. He looks at foundations, and if those foundations are corroded by vanity and hardness, no uniform can hide it. My life was rebuilt not when I climbed to the top of the hierarchy, but when I accepted to begin again from the ground of humility. Making amends did not erase my past, but it transformed the way I carried it. Before, every memory crushed me with shame. Now, each memory became a reminder that there is always a chance to rebuild. I learned it is not enough to take off the uniform on the outside. The cracks inside must be stitched together with acts of truth, and little by little, I realized that every act of reparation not only eased my heart, but also became part of what it means to live the faith I had found. This path of return was not simple, but it was the only one capable of showing me that true transformation does not happen in the high skies I crossed so many times. It happens on solid ground in daily life, when we acknowledge our mistakes, rise with humility, and offer something better to those around us. That was how I finally understood that the bridge between guilt and reparation was the path that restored the dignity I myself had lost. That night, the base was in absolute silence. No radio on, no footsteps in the corridors, only the muffled sound of my heartbeat. I entered the room and closed the door, as if sealing a pact. I knelt on the simple rug I used only for rest, and for the first time my words were not reports, not responses to commands, not justifications. I pronounced the Shahada. There were no fireworks or effects reminiscent of military victories. What I felt was something far more solid, order. An order that came not from generals or external authorities, but from the clarity of finally knowing to whom my life belonged. I stood up and looked around. The same walls, the same plane parked outside, the same instruments I had always mastered. But inside me there was something new, an undeniable difference. It was as if all the gears that had spun out of sync had finally aligned. I still wore the same uniform, but I was no longer the same man. I needed no medals to prove it. The inner silence was enough. Conscience, however, soon brought a dilemma: how to reconcile this transformation with an environment where loyalty was measured by silence and career by obedience. I knew that a public confession of faith could be seen as a threat, even as treason. The system in which I had lived for decades did not permit course changes without a flight plan. There, doubts became weaknesses, faith became suspicion, and I carried, beyond conviction, access to secrets the world could never know. I spent days hiding signs. I kept a rigid posture, formal salutes, intact discipline. But inside, routine was no longer the same. Every briefing seemed to echo in a strange language, while every verse I recalled sounded familiar. I feigned attention in endless reports on strategies and operations, but my heart remembered the serenity of a short, absolute phrase: Allah is one. This duplicity was unbearable. In the military field, any deviation could cost lives. In the spiritual field, failing to speak could cost the soul itself. It was as if I were piloting under overcast skies, knowing that sooner or later I would have to choose whether to follow the course laid out by others or the route that had opened within me. There were no witnesses to that first decision, only me, my heart, and the one who sees all. But that choice, silent and without an audience, was already beginning to shape consequences that could no longer be avoided. From that moment, I discovered that true courage was not in facing enemy radars or crossing hostile territories. It was in holding firm to the newfound faith, even when no one else understood it. And that battle, though invisible to others, would be the most demanding mission of my life. The inner transformation did not take long to generate external signs. Superiors, alert to every detail of behavior, began calling me for routine interviews. The questions were asked casually, but I could feel the hidden weight behind them. They wanted to know if I was still reliable, if my loyalty remained unshaken. With every restrained answer, I noticed the distance grow. Invitations to strategic meetings dwindled, informal contacts grew cold, and little by little I was removed from the most visible missions. What to many would have been an irreparable loss sounded to me like freedom. Instead of transporting leaders who decided the fate of nations in closed offices, I was assigned to routes carrying something far more urgent: doctors on mission, vital supplies, entire families fleeing war zones. The red carpet corridors gave way to improvised hangars, and the silence of prestigious jets was replaced by the cries of children and the gratitude of those who saw the plane as their only chance of survival. On one of those flights, surrounded by boxes of medicine and the roar of the engine, I felt a small hand touch my arm. A child, dressed simply with a deep gaze, held my wrist and murmured just one word: "Brother." That brief gesture held more meaning than all the titles I had accumulated over decades of service. No ceremony, no medal, no official speech had ever given me the sense of belonging contained in that single word. While I lost the showcase of institutional prestige, I gained something infinitely greater: direction. Purpose was no longer in orders handed down from above, but guided by a conviction that needed no protocols. I discovered that peace is not found in halls lit by spotlights, but in the silence of serving without expecting applause. With every takeoff, with every landing, I felt that I was finally carrying more than aircraft. I was carrying lives toward hope. Clashing with the system was inevitable. Losing ground in structures that demand blind obedience is the price for those who choose to live by the truth. Even so, that price did not weigh on me. On the contrary, it revealed that the freedom I had been seeking was never found in golden cages or positions of highest trust. It was in the ability to align my actions with what my heart already knew to be right. In the cockpit, surrounded by instruments and panels I knew by memory, I was no longer flying only by protocol. Each flight became a silent prayer, each landing a confirmation that I had chosen the right path. The system could push me away from its official victories, but it could not prevent me from finding deeper meaning in every mission. What to them looked like demotion, to me was elevation. Thus, I understood that true altitude is not measured in feet or miles. It is measured in integrity. And even at 40,000 feet, isolated among clouds, I learned that no applause carries more weight than the purpose of serving in the name of truth. I am relearning how to pray. It seems simple to write that phrase, but for someone shaped by decades of military discipline, every gesture of prayer is also an act of unlearning. Before, every morning began with reports, instructions, and orders. Now it begins with words that do not draft protocols, but align my heart with something greater. There is no checklist that prepares you for this. There is only humility. With each supplication, I realize that the arrogance accumulated over the years does not disappear at once. It resists, tries to hold on, but before true prayer, it yields. It is in that space between pride and surrender that I find the beginning of peace. Studying has become part of my new routine. I moved from reading technical manuals to reflecting on verses that speak of mercy and justice. Where once I saw only instructions on takeoff, altitude, and speed, I now find directions that touch unseen dimensions. It is no longer about guiding aircraft to geographical destinations. It is about guiding my life to an eternal one. And this shift in perspective requires patient study. Each verse I read opens a door that never closes again. I discover that faith is not improvisation, but neither is it rigidity. It is constant learning, like flying through changing weather, adjusting inner instruments at every stretch of the route. Part of this learning involves transforming guilt into service. For a long time, guilt was a weight that paralyzed me. I recalled faces, cities, voices of people impacted by decisions I helped execute, and I sank under it. Now, I understand guilt can be fuel. It does not drag me down, but pushes me toward reparation. I began dedicating my time not only to work, but also to simple gestures that, though discreet, are full of meaning. I visit communities. I offer listening where once I gave only silence. I help with what I have. And above all, I strive not to repeat the same mistake of believing My position gave me the right to ignore those who suffer. Less talk, more repair. That has become the rule I try to follow. Because I realize that speaking of transformation without living it is like planning a route without ever taking off. It is empty, so I prefer my actions to speak for me. If before the hardness of the uniform shielded me from others, now faith invites me to make room for them. I discovered that often people do not need complex explanations but presence. A gesture of attention, a sincere word, a simple apology can carry more truth than any report I ever wrote. It is striking how, looking back, I see I was trained to hide vulnerabilities. The system told me showing weakness was a sign of failure. Today, I understand that admitting limits is proof of humanity. True strength is not in never falling, but in rising with purpose. I have learned there is purer air outside of pride, an air that does not suffocate or oppress, but liberates. When I breathe that air, I feel I no longer need to wear the mask of being invincible. I can simply be someone trying to walk toward the truth. This process led me to recognize that there is no solitary path. Even though my decision was made in the silence of a closed room, I see that every step I take reaches people I may never meet. When I share my story, I see messages arrive from distant places, from people who identify with pieces of it. Some faced different dilemmas, others are still fighting inner battles, but all carry the desire to find meaning. That is why I chose to tell this journey out loud, because I know it is not only about me, but about all those who at some point realize that old certainties can no longer sustain the heart. And here, a word of gratitude is due. Gratitude to those who listen, to those who read, to those who share. Gratitude even to those who criticize, because criticism also reminds me that this testimony is not meant to convince, but to expose what transformed me. The simple fact that someone takes the time to learn this story is already part of a greater process. I never expected that my life, marked by planes and military missions, would also become a story told in another space. But I came to understand that faith transforms not only personal paths but also the way we reach one another. Today, every account I give is also a commitment not to disguise what I lived, not to soften my failures nor exaggerate my achievements. I want it to be clear that change was not a spectacle, but a process, that there was no choir of angels at the moment of decision, but rather silence, tears, and the certainty of standing before something greater than any position or power I had ever known. This commitment demands that I be honest even if it costs me judgment or distrust, and part of that commitment is expressed in continuing to take this story forward. This is where I make a sincere request. If this story has uplifted you, consider using super thanks. I don't say this as someone seeking applause or recognition, but as someone who understands that this work must go on. This financial support helps the channel take stories like mine to more people, sustaining an effort that reaches hearts I could never reach alone. Each support received becomes new testimonies, new voices that find a space to share their experiences. It is not only about keeping a channel alive, it is about creating a network of transformed lives that inspire one another. With every comment, with every message, I realize I am not only speaking, I am connecting. And it is that connection that gives meaning to everything. That is why I thank not only those who contribute, but all who walk with me on this journey. Gratitude for every attentive ear, every open eye, every heart willing to reflect. My commitment is to keep telling, keep learning, and keep serving, because in the end it is not about me. It is about what I found when I stopped fighting alone and allowed faith to guide me. Today, if someone asks me what changed, I do not answer with reports or numbers. I answer with the calm I carry and with the purpose that guides me. This is the greatest medal I have ever received, living with integrity, without needing to prove anything to anyone but God. And that, more than any career, is what I want to leave as my legacy. What I have shared is only a part of a process that continues every day, inside and outside of me. Each prayer I learn, each repair I seek to make, each person I meet along the way adds new layers to this story. What once seemed like the end, loss of career, removal of titles, public questioning, turned out to be a beginning, a chance to walk lightly without carrying the weight of masks that never belonged to me. When I look back, I realize that the greatest transformation was not simply leaving behind a uniform or a rank. The real change happened in the inner silence, in that space where no one but God can enter. It is there that the strength arises, that keeps me standing even when everything seemed to collapse. That strength does not come from military strategies or survival manuals. It comes from the certainty that there is purpose, even in what others would call failure. In sharing my experience, I do not seek to convince or to argue. What I want is to offer something that may resonate in the heart of the one who listens. Perhaps you have never lived anything resembling planes, wars, or high-level decisions, but at some point, you have likely felt that emptiness that cannot be filled with external achievements. It is at that point that my story connects with yours, in recognizing that we need something greater than titles and temporary victories. So do not keep to yourself what touched your heart here. Share this video in groups and on social media. Someone you know may be living days of deep silence, surrounded by external noise, yet unable to find peace within. Sometimes, just a minute of listening can change the direction of an entire life. That is what happened to me. One unexpected instant opened space for a transformation nothing in my training could have foreseen. That minute may be waiting for someone else now, and you may be the channel through which they find it. Now, if you felt this story brought you something valuable, I invite you to keep walking with me. There are more reflections, more accounts, more points of connection I want to share. Each video is a new opportunity to look inward, and at the same time, see how our individual stories connect into something greater. So if you can, do not stop here. Watch the next video. Perhaps in it you will find answers that have not yet appeared. Perhaps it will only confirm something you already suspected deep in your soul. Or perhaps it will simply be a pause in the middle of the rush, a breath that is worth it in itself. Whatever the case, I know it will not be wasted time. Just as every minute I spent revisiting my own life turned into learning, I also believe that every minute you dedicate to this journey can bring unexpected fruit. Some paths lift us up, others test us, but all have value when we manage to see beyond the immediate. May this account be for you an invitation to look at your own route with greater attention, and if something here lit a spark, remember, light was not made to be hidden. It was made to shine. So share, reflect, and if you feel it in your heart, keep walking with me. Until the next video, because sometimes it is in the very next step that the greatest revelation waits.